Hey everybody, Daniel here. Welcome back. We're continuing a conversation we began in the last video about how we can trust the Bible. We specifically looked at the last video on the Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, how they don't have contradictions, how they're reliable, how they're trustworthy, they're recording the real events of Jesus' life. Now, if you're interested in that, check out the last video. But today we're going to zoom in a little bit different. We're going to zoom in on the person of Jesus. All right? Is Jesus real or fiction? Is he a real historical person? This is a very central question, because if Jesus is just a story, like maybe these authors just made up a story that they liked, and they're kind of trying to teach a moral lesson, then we shouldn't take it any more seriously than any kind of story that we hear that's not real, all right? But if Jesus is a real historical person, we need to take very serious things that he said. There's a man named Earl Daughtry who defined Jesus' mysticism as this. He defined what Jesus' mysticism is. He says this: it's the theory that no historical Jesus worthy of the name existed, that Christianity began with the belief in a spiritual mystical figure, that the Gospels are essentially allegory and fiction, and that no single identifiable person lay at the root of the Galilean preaching tradition. So they would say Jesus mysticists, he would say, are people that believe there's no historical Jesus. All right. There's a man by the name of Robert Price who would hold to something like this. He's a critic of Christianity, specifically the historical Jesus. He stated this: everything we read about Jesus in the New Testament conforms to the mystic hero. There's nothing left over that indicates that he was a real historical person. So Price is arguing that Jesus is in fact not real. All right, he was made up to start a movement or whatever, but he is not a real historical person. Now, we want to deal with that question. All right, this is a vital question. If we're choosing, and I'm saying, hey, follow Jesus, I want to be like, am I telling you to follow some made-up character, or am I telling you to follow a true, real, historical person? So to deal with this question, we want to look at sources and historical documents that were written in and around and after the time of Jesus. Do they state and show that Jesus is a real historical person? We want to look at this, and specifically at sources outside the Bible. All right? Yes, of course, we look at the Bible. I believe the Gospels are historical documents, but today we're going to be looking at documents and historical writings outside the Bible. Now, if you're interested in more of this in detail, look at a man named Habermas. He's done a lot more work on this, but we're going to look at a few historical documents and writings that mention and note Jesus, giving weight that Jesus is a real historical person. The first one I'll start with is a Roman historian by the name of Tacitus. He wrote and lived during the 155 AD all the way to about 120 AD. That was when he was around. And he is known as one of the greatest Roman historians. That he is known to have written with integrity, with knowledge. Skeptics of Christianity would acknowledge this about Tacitus. And he wrote in 114, this is something he stated, I think is very powerful. All right. He says, consequently, to get rid of the report, Nero fastened the guilt and inflicted the most exquisite torture on a class hated for their abomination, called Christians, by the populus Christus, from whom the name has its origin, suffered the extreme penalty during the reign of Tiberius at the hands of the one procurator, Pontius Pilate, and a most mischievous superstition, thus checked for a moment, again broke out only in Judea, not only in Judea, the first source of evil, but even in Rome. So just from this, what can we see that Tacitus is noting about Jesus? He's noting about there's a man by the name of Christ, or that people called Christ or Christus, all right? And this group of Christians get their name from him. This Christ was put to death by Pontius Pilate during the reign of Tiberius. And he's saying, hey, the message was checked for a little bit, but then broke out again. The meaning, which I believe it points to, and many historians will argue this, that points to when Jesus died, the message was checked, but he rose again. His disciples start preaching that Jesus rose again. And so then the message keeps going out. All right. So this is what we get just from this document: that Jesus was real, that he lived, that a group of Christians get their name from him, that he was killed. And when it says the extreme penalty, is referring to crucifixion, that he was killed under Pontius Pilate, and that during the reign of Tiberius. This same thing is referred to in the Gospel of Luke, but this is from Tacitus, a Roman historian. Now, you got another historian, a Jewish historian. He lived from about 36 to 100 AD by the name of Josephus. He mentions Jesus, and this is something he states. He says, now there was about that time Jesus a wise man, if be lawful to call him wise, for he was a doer of wonders, a teacher of such men as received the truth with pleasure. He drew many after him, both the Jews and the Gentiles. He was the Christ. When Pilate, at the suggestion of principal men among him, had condemned him to the cross, those who loved him at first did not forsake him, for he appeared to them alive after the third day, as the divine prophets foretold these and 10,000 other wonderful things about him. And the tribe of Christians, so named from him, are not extinct to this day. Now, the majority of this text, historians have noted, is very authentic. It is Josephus writing. Now, there's a few phrases in here that we know that's added later. That's not Josephus, such as he was the Christ is not written by Josephus, or that the divine prophets foretold of this, most likely not written by Josephus. But the rest, the majority of the text, is authentic to Josephus. And what is he reporting? He's talking about this group of Christians, this sect of Christians that began. He's talking about how they began. They came from this person named Jesus, all right? That he was who this person was, that people followed him, both Jews and both Gentiles. They began to follow him. He was crucified under Pilate. That his disciples then also claimed that he rose again later and did not forsake him. This is all just from Josephus. This is pretty powerful stuff. So we just see a Roman historian named Tacitus. We see a Jewish historian named Josephus. And let me point out a couple other ones, all right? You have another Roman historian by the name of Suetonius. All right, he wrote about these riots that took place in Rome where the Emperor Claudius expelled the Jews out of Rome in about 49 AD. This historical event took place, but he writes this: because the Jews at Rome caused continuous disruption at the instigation of Christ, he expelled them from the city. So what's he saying? There's like tension happening between these Jews, and they didn't know right away who they were, but it was all centered around this Christ figure, this Christ. So it's like, what's going on? So he's referring to this Christ, which is in reference to Jesus, that this tension is happening in Rome because of him. All right. You have other writers like Plinary the Younger, who is writing referring to how to deal with Christians, because to the emperor, it's like, I don't know how to deal with these Christians because they're unwilling to worship the image of the emperor. He states this. He says, they, the Christians, were in the habit of meeting on a certain fixed day before it was light. They sang an alternative verse, a hymn to Christ as to a God. So, and he's writing again about 112 AD. And he was a Roman governor in modern Turkey, and he's just kind of saying, hey, there's this group of Christians. They're not worshiping anything about the Roman emperor or anything. They worship or pray to this figure Christ, who they refer to as God. So he's emphasizing that this is central to it. So you go a little bit further. You got also some Greek historians. I'll mention one by the name of Lucian. He was also he was a critic of Christianity, but he wrote about the second century. He states that the Christians, worship a man to this day. The distinguished personage who introduced their novel rites and was crucified on the account. They worship the crucified sage and live after his laws. He's noting, and he's a critic of Christianity, that these Christians are following this figure that was crucified. This all referred to Christ, who was crucified, and they follow him and how he lived. You also have the Jewish Talmud, which were writings that took place between 70 and 200 AD. They state this: on the eve of Passover, Yeshua was hanged. Now, in Jewish writing, hung or hanged or hung on a tree was a euphemism for public execution and or crucifixion. So they're saying this: Yeshua was publicly executed or crucified on the eve of Passover, which is exactly what took place to Jesus, as we see from the Gospels. Now, if you go outside of these and you look at early Christian writings, early church fathers, you have the list of sources building up, all right, for the 2nd and 3rd century. But we won't look at those. So we just want to, again, look at non-Christian historical writings. And with just non-Christian historical writings like Josephus, Tacitus, Suetonius, what can we see about this Jesus? We see that he's real. That he's a historical person. He really lived. You see this group of Christians get their name from him. You see he lived around the 1st century AD. You see that he gathered followers of both Jewish and Gentile. You see that some believe that he was the Messiah. You see that he was crucified under Pontius Pilate. You see that Tiberius was emperor when he was crucified. You see that his followers began to declare not that much longer later that they had seen him risen from the dead. And you see also they began to worship him, the followers, and after began to worship him as divine and or God. So this is all that we see from all these ancient non-historical documents. Now you might ask, well, Daniel, why aren't there more details that we have? Well, it's simply this. While Jesus was alive, he was relatively unimportant to those that were in power in writing history. He was a Galilean from a small town. He had no political power. He was not a king, an emperor, a warrior. So the amount of information that we have written is exactly the amount of information that you would expect. Because again, he was unimportant to them. So in conclusion to this question, is Jesus historical or is he fiction? He is a real historical person. Jesus is not fiction. He is not made up. He is real historical. You get that obviously from the Gospels, but you get that from outside sources like Tacitus, Suetonius, Josephus, and others, confirming that Jesus is a real historical person who lived, who died under Pontius Pilate while Tiberius was emperor, and whose followers began to claim that they saw him rise from the dead. The group of Christians get their name from him, and that they began to worship him as God or divine. So, this is what we see, and you have probably tons of other questions that go into this, and we'll look at more of those in another video, but I hope this helps to understand that Jesus is, in fact, a real historical person. Hey, if you found this video useful, helpful, I encourage you like and subscribe, share this on to other people, and I'll see you guys in other videos.